Welcome to Now and Next in Public Affairs, brought to you by Helio Intelligence, the home of de Havilland and Forefront. We are here, of course, to discuss the future of public affairs, and I'm joined today by David Boo. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Not at all. David, let's start with yourself, if that's okay. In terms of your experience in public affairs, you are currently the UK Director of Public Affairs and Policy at the Road Haulage Association, as well as being the chair of the Public Affairs Group at the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, which is quite a lot to squeeze into a sentence on reflection. You've worked in the profession for nearly 20 years, and you've got a lot of experience. So for the benefit of our listeners, you've worked at LNER, NOC, Gatwick Airport, National Highways. You spent some time in the consultancy space, and very fortunately for us, you actually used to work at de Havilland many moons ago. So
where I started my career.
Absolutely.
A long time ago.
So can you talk us through a little bit about your experience and how the profession's evolved?
Yeah, so obviously lots of things have changed during those 19 years. Some things remain the same. So if you go to party conferences, the format of those, how they're put together, the type of fringe events that you go to, and the format of those is very much what it was when I first started. I guess three of the biggest changes I'd point to. One is around the centrality of public affairs. So when I started, everyone was focused on Westminster. And public affairs professionals lived mainly in London or commutable to London. And one of the biggest changes we've seen in those 19 years is a change in that. So when I started, public affairs industries in Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland were not as developed as they are today. So there are bigger public affairs industries in all of those areas. And of course, we have devolution. So we have lots more public affairs professionals based across the UK. So the way we do public affairs, where people are based, who they talk to, is very different to when I started 19 years ago. So the sort of the regional aspect is very different. On the diversity side, we still have far to go, but we are an industry that is more diverse than when I first started. When I first started, it was certainly male dominated. We've seen a lot more women coming into public affairs. Far to go, but there is a more diverse workforce in public affairs. What we need to see more of is particularly diversity when it comes to socio-economic background. So there aren't many in public affairs from a working class background like mine. I think this may start to change, partly with the first point around politics not just being focused in Westminster. So there is a way to go in that area. And the third thing I'd say is around the role of public affairs and connection to wider communications. So when I first started, you would get standalone public affairs agencies. Now, all agencies are integrated, so they will do public affairs, they will do media relations, social media, and perhaps internal comms and research as well. So there's certainly been a change in expectations when it comes to what public affairs is, how it slots into a wider communications strategy or campaign. So I think public affairs is more prominent than it has been, but also it fits more into a wider communications discipline rather than being something that is separate to that.
Thank you, David. There's loads to unpack there. Maybe if I start on the last point you made around communications, do you have a sense of, in terms of how the profession's evolved, do you find, or do you have any thoughts on whether it's become more of an internal status, or does it have more value within the context of how a business operates?
I think it does. I think more businesses take public affairs seriously. There is more investment in public affairs functions. You certainly see that. I think what has become apparent over recent years is just the importance of big change in politics. So if you look at Brexit, if you look at the rise of Trump, there are huge drivers when it comes to what businesses, what organisations need to be aware of. And there are changes impacting on them in a bigger way than ever before. I think when I first started, politics seemed quite predictable. So we had very much a two-party system. You had public affairs agencies, organisations lobbying on specific things, quite often quite niche things. Now there are the big political issues, the big political drivers that organisations need to be aware of, as well as try and influence some of those more micro issues, some of those regulatory issues that they're interested in. So I think the role within organisations is certainly bigger. I think more people are aware of what public affairs is, and I don't see that changing. I think there is a need for even greater insight, even greater understanding of what's happening in the outside world. And the rise of reform is another issue that organisations are looking at, thinking, what does it mean for me? And there is a huge value. There's always been a value in public affairs professionals providing that strategic view, but that's becoming even more so. And I think leaders are starting to see that more and more and see the value of having a strong public affairs function.
I would tend to agree. Thank you. We're going to come back to party conferences a bit later on, and we'll no doubt talk a little bit about both the geopolitical environment as well as the domestic environment here in the UK. I wanted to pick up on one of the things you mentioned earlier about diversity and getting more people into the profession from certain socioeconomic backgrounds. The reason I want to bring this up and maybe just focus on it for a few moments is when we had Claire McParland on the podcast very early doors, one of the topics we discussed was education. We didn't go into a lot of detail, but we were talking about how the profession will need to adapt when it comes to the next generation of talent and so on. And it's something I'm really, really interested in having. I don't know what your educational experience was like, but when I was at school, you couldn't study politics at GCSE. You had to do it at A level. So in that setting, you're already excluding so many students at a young age. And I just wonder whether you have a view or any thoughts at all on how we expose not just politics, but public affairs as a profession to young people.
Yeah, I think you're right about what you said. Certainly my own education and the teaching of politics. So I didn't study politics until my degree. I think that's the same for quite a few people within the public affairs profession. There is an interest amongst young people to understand politics, public affairs, what is going on in the world, how people interact with it. This is probably one of the reasons why I've always been in favour of votes at 16, because what that means is that political parties need to take a more serious view of young people. So young people aged 16 to 18 who currently can't vote, but actually when you increase the electorate, there will be greater focus from those political parties on this new group of voters. And I think that's really important because that means that people will start to have policies and messaging targeted at them. So that will increase political engagement, it will increase political understanding. I think to your point about careers, there's still not an understanding of what the public affairs industry is from a career education perspective. I suspect there are few careers advisors who say, you can work in public affairs, this is what it means. So I think there is a huge role for those in public affairs to help explain what the public affairs industry is and to help encourage people into it. There are lots of organisations that focus on that sort of entry level point. So those coming in after degrees usually, but very little focus on those 16 to 18. So I think the driver and the route to better understanding is probably an increase in participation in politics, which will be driven by a lowering of the voting age. So hopefully that will be a driver we'll certainly see in the years ahead.
Yeah, it's a topic of constant intrigue for myself. My sister is a teacher and has been a teacher for 15 plus years or so, and we come from a family background in teaching. And one of the debates I had with her a number of years ago about why I wasn't going to go into teaching was because I felt at that time that the educational experience I had didn't necessarily prepare me for the modern world. And I think it would slightly alter my view if you could maybe teach politics. I'm not saying all day, every day, but you could teach a form of politics to young people from the age of, well, definitely GCSE, definitely, maybe even at an earlier age, because I think that the lack of understanding of politics in general, a lack of awareness, and then subsequently the impact on the profession isn't good.
No, and part of that is some of the basic understanding about how governments work, how political parties work, what the leaders in a political system do, I guess, on a day-to-day basis, but also how they get there and the powers that they have. But there's also, within that, there's also the skills around public affairs. So obviously, I think is a really important skill to teach, and that really does feed into public affairs. So the ability to persuade, the ability to create an argument and to argue your corner, I think is a really important skill, not just for those in public affairs, but wider as well. So I'd like to see probably a bit of both, which is that almost mechanical view of what politics is, the process point, but more broadly, what are the skills that politicians need, and how is that relevant to not just those who want to work in public affairs or politics, but everyone. There are certain skills that good politicians possess, the ability to make an argument, the ability to understand lots of information, the ability to listen, the ability to come up with new ideas. So many important skills that people can take into other roles, not just public affairs.
It's a really good segue for me to take the conversation back to one of the first things you said about how, in your experience, in 19 years, some things have changed, and you've talked us through how things that have changed, but also the things that haven't changed. And you mentioned conferences, and we will obviously talk about conferences. And for the benefit of the listeners, we're recording. We're 3 days before we go to Labour conference, so we're right in the middle of conference season. The skills you mentioned, are there any other things that stand out as being consistent in your early days and right the way through to where we are today?
I think skills around persuasion, I think, are really important. So whether that's public speaking, whether that's verbally creating an argument and persuading others about your point of view, or whether that's writing a briefing or a consultation response. So being able to put your thoughts down on paper and to create a coherent and powerful argument. I think those skills of persuasion are as relevant now as when I first started. I guess a passion for politics. I think when you start out in public affairs, you understand a certain amount about politics and how things work, but you learn so much early on about what makes parties tick, how to approach political parties, what issues might resonate with them. And that helps later in your career when you're developing public affairs strategies, and actually you've got a sense of how a position can land with a particular party. So I think a passion and interest in politics is so important, and I think you need that at every stage. But I think certainly when I'm recruiting, and I have recruited those just entering their public affairs career, so their first job in public affairs, one of the things I would look for is that passion and interest, because it's a very dull industry if you're not interested in politics. And having that interest helps develop an understanding. The fact that you observe, you look, you learn, you continually refine, and at the heart of that you need an interest in politics. You need to be politically engaged to really enter public affairs and succeed in public affairs.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think my observations on the public affairs ecosystem is, in some respects, it's a bit niche. I definitely accept that. And I think to a certain extent, most of the people in my 7 odd years just love politics. And whether it's party politics or the mechanics of it, there always seems to be that passion and interest for it. And as you say, if you're working in the sector and you're not passionate about it, you're going to have some very, very long days.
Yeah. And it's continually changing. So if you've been in the industry a year, 10 years, 20 years, things are always developing. New things are happening. Going back to what I said earlier about party conferences, the format of them being very much the same now as 19, 20 years ago when I went to my first party conferences. But what is different and what keeps people interested is that the policy is changing, the politics is changing, the personnel are changing, the political characters are changing. So the format might be the same. You've got a panel event or you've got a reception in Parliament, but the content, the context as well is continually changing, which keeps public affairs interesting. That everything is always changing, even though some of the ways in which you do your engagement from the outside haven't changed in years, but actually the content, the context is completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is another good segue for us to talk a little bit about technology and specifically AI. What are your views on AI in general? And also, what are your views on how it's going to impact the profession?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think there are huge pros to AI. So within the public affairs context, you can easily see where this will have a huge impact. The development of briefings for MPs, drafting letters to MPs, drafting amendments to legislation, which is always quite tricky. So if you are able to rely on tools that help you do that, there's a huge benefit to how you do public affairs. And if we get it right, this can free up a lot of time and almost create more space for public affairs professionals to do some of the face-to-face relationship building and engagement. So there's a huge benefit to this technology used in the right way. I think one of the cons might be, what does this mean for the entry-level roles within public affairs? So I spoke to somebody in a consultancy a few months ago, and he said that in his organisation, the structures almost become like an inverse pyramid, that you've got lots of strategic advisors at the top of the organisation. Then you've got your account directors, account managers, and actually you're seeing fewer team members at that entry-level account executive level. So the inverse pyramid is you've got all these senior people offering strategic political advice, and then you've got the management of accounts. But actually that entry-level strata that we've had in the past, that you go in, you start doing the briefings, and then you move to a stage where you're doing more of the meetings and it develops that way. So it'll be interesting to understand what AI means for that part of the ecosystem. Because going back to what we said before, getting into public affairs is important. We always need new people. We always need greater diversity. What will we see through the greater use of AI? Will it be a removal of some of those roles? And if so, how will we get the public affairs professionals of the future? Will we be seeing more coming in from other sectors and actually coming in at mid-senior level rather than that entry-level position? So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't have the answer, certainly, but I think it's something we need to think about as an industry, about what happens to those roles as we rely more and more on AI.
So I would agree, and this is a topic that we've talked about on other podcasts in slightly different ways. And I agree with what you're saying, because ultimately, if you don't have, I guess, if I take a step back and look at it from a business perspective, if you look at succession planning and talent management, etc., people, as you described quite well, in senior advisory roles now and account roles, they're there because they have gained a degree of knowledge and experience through ultimately the professional journey that they've gone on to that point. And if the AI is going to essentially take out the entry-level jobs, how is the next generation of the profession meant to get their experience or their knowledge? And I don't think anybody knows the answer to this yet, which is why it's such an interesting discussion. And the point you raised there around, are we going to get people from other sectors or professions come into public affairs at a later stage, is something I hadn't necessarily considered. But just thinking on my feet here, it is quite interesting, because the transferable skills with public affairs, I imagine if you've got somebody that has an interest in politics and has a degree of experience and is a strong communicator and can articulate their point of view quite well, then on paper they could be a good fit for the profession.
Yeah, it's interesting to try and second guess what's happening now and what will happen in the near future and where people will come from. Because there is a reality that if you are working in public affairs, you need to work in the industry, you need to develop skills before you're doing a lot of that face-to-face engagement. So when you first enter public affairs, you're probably supporting a leader, having a meeting with an MP, and then you will develop the skills to then lead those meetings yourself. Now, if we don't have those entry-level roles, then it's unlikely you're going to go straight into an organisation and lead MP meetings from day one without any experience. So it's interesting to try and second guess what will happen. So it could be that people come in from other sectors, and actually that almost account management side of it is something they've learned from other industries, but it's hard to second guess where we're going.
And do you have a view at all on how an MP's offices, even government departments are going to leverage AI?
In short, I don't. You can see where the opportunities are. So from an MP perspective, you might get lots of queries on a particular issue, and actually AI can help you formulate a detailed response to those issues. So workload-wise, you can see where AI has a role to play. And from a civil servant point of view, the use of AI in reading consultation responses and being able to synthesize some of the themes that are coming out. What that doesn't give you, and something that will still need a human element to it, is, okay, so you've got these themes within consultation responses. Actually, where are those ideas coming from? You might have consistent themes, but then you've got maybe large membership organisations might be saying something completely different. So not every consultation response is the same. So there needs to be a certain level of strategic judgment that perhaps still requires a human element to the process. But you can see at the beginning of that process, the filtering, the synthesizing can be done by AI. So you can certainly see where the opportunities are, but I've got no hard evidence of it, but you can certainly see where it might happen.
My final question on this area before we move along is going back to when you were talking about the benefits of AI. You talked about some of the operational elements to the profession, but ultimately the benefit being, in theory, you get time back. And I'm really interested just to, hypothetically spit the dust on, let's say in a year's time, you as a function have embraced AI and it's giving you time back. Let's just say that you get half a day or a day back that you didn't have. What are you going to do in that half a day or day?
Well, as I always say with public affairs, it's very elastic. I've always said this internally, we could have 10 more people in the public affairs team, we still have enough to do. I think what it could mean is greater face-to-face engagement. So whether that's with MPs, whether it's with regional mayors, councillors, or members. So if you're part of a member organisation, actually, you can do more of that feedback. You can create that feedback loop a bit more successfully. So what I mean by that is you're meeting MPs, but actually are you explaining to your members or your executives what's happening and how progress is being made. So there is the greater opportunity to make people aware of what you're doing. And obviously the benefits of that are to get buy-in and to move your campaign along to the next stage. So there is a huge amount of potential value here. And, going back to one of the themes that we touched on earlier about some things being very much the same as they were 19 years ago, the way you interact with MPs is slightly different. You do more online meetings now, but actually the format of a meeting is still very much similar because it's about coming up with your argument, talking to an MP, persuading them, being clear about what you want, what you'd like to see, and listening to them and having a two-way conversation. And that hasn't changed. And there is huge value in that. And if you can free up even a little bit of time to do more of those conversations, then that's hugely beneficial. And there's also the other conversations that you might have. You might have more conversations with parliamentary staffers or those who work for political parties. So have those conversations about manifestos that little bit earlier, because you have that time. You have that time to invest in relationships before you need them. And I think that's always crucial within public affairs. If you go really late on to a stakeholder, you're not going to get the value you would have got if you'd engaged earlier. And being able to have those proactive conversations is a real benefit to anyone in public affairs, being able to have that time, that space, that energy to have those conversations just that little bit earlier, and be able to start those campaigns, start those conversations before it becomes an imperative for your organisation.
Really good stuff, thank you. Let's move on slightly. In terms of, if we look at the next 5 years as a time period, what would you say are the non-negotiables for the profession in terms of its relevance and delivering that value?
I'd say the first thing is probably ethics. So ensuring what you do is done in an ethical way. So thinking about what the CIPR does around ethical lobbying, I think it's hugely important for members of the CIPR and really important for the wider public affairs community as well, that what we do is seen as ethical, and there is an organisation pushing for greater openness around lobbying. I think anyone who works in public affairs should welcome greater openness because it gives us greater legitimacy. So I think the way we do public affairs needs to be done in an ethical way, but it also needs to be seen to be done in an ethical way. And I think that, for me, is a non-negotiable. Touching on a few themes that we've already spoken about, I guess a non-negotiable or something that isn't changing is that ability to persuade. That's not going to change. So the skills of writing a coherent narrative, a strong argument is really important, and be able to articulate that within meetings, to the media, or on a public stage. So those persuasive skills are as important today as they have always been. So that is a non-negotiable skill. And, I come back to it again, but passion for politics. I think you always need that. I think if you lose that interest and that passion, then it's probably time to think about another sector, because there is so much going on. And I think to understand it, you need to think a lot about what is happening, what it means for you, and almost try and second guess some of the key drivers within politics, within public affairs, which is hard to do. But at the root of that is understanding, and that can only come through passion and working at your craft.
Well said. David, that's been really interesting. I imagine, knowing you as I do, we could talk about this for a lot longer, but we have limited time. So let's get to some slightly lighter questions to finish the episode. You mentioned party conference right at the start of today's episode. My question now is, over 19 years, what would be your favourite memory or best party conference story?
Probably less of a story and more of a moment. I think a sort of political moment. I've always found party conferences insightful. So whether it's listening to members at fringe events, understanding some of those issues that are sort of bubbling up under the surface, or whether it's those political moments that have a huge impact on the future of politics. One of the moments that stands out for me is probably the election of Ed Miliband. So that was such a surprise. So being there in the room when that was announced, it was a surprise in politics, which not many people saw coming. And if you look to the present day, that's had an impact on a lot in British politics. You could pinpoint the rise of Corbyn through the changes that Ed Miliband brought in. That you could perhaps say Brexit was made more likely because of Jeremy Corbyn's stance on Europe. All debatable points, but you can see that being such a huge political moment. And for me, party conference is about, this is the centre of British politics for the next few days. So being there, understanding it, viewing it close up is always really exciting. So going back to the passion point, it fuels passions. So for me, that is one of the most interesting party conferences, that moment and the subsequent impact that it's had on British politics.
I can only echo that, and I have to be slightly careful about what I say. What I would say specifically about that moment in time is I think things could have been a lot different. And I do think that happened when I was 20 years old, and I'm now 35. And in the 15 years since, there's been a lot of things that have happened, and it's all debatable, obviously, because what's happened is happened. But it is also foreseeable that things could have gone down a different road, and I will probably leave it there. That's as diplomatic as I can make it.
Nicely put.
Thank you. A couple more questions. If that's okay. Who is your favourite Prime Minister?
I have a big soft spot for Gordon Brown for personal reasons and political. I think he's an interesting figure. He's a huge figure within Labour politics because he's very passionate about child poverty, about global poverty. He's very knowledgeable and a decent man, I think. From a personal perspective, I stood for Parliament in 2010. So I did a number of hustings where I was defending the record of the then government. So I spent many hours arguing in sports halls in favour of what Gordon Brown has done and was doing at the time. So for me, Gordon Brown is a figure of interest and my personal favourite Prime Minister of recent times.
And then my follow-up question to that is, who's the best Prime Minister that the UK has never had?
I love that question. I'm going to give quite a geeky answer, so apologies to listeners who haven't studied politics in depth. But I'm going to go for a really old school one, which is Roy Jenkins. He was a figure within the Wilson and Callaghan governments. He was a very active Home Secretary, a very liberalising Home Secretary, served as Chancellor. He formed the SDP. He was also an EU Commissioner as well. So if you look at just the breadth of his career, it's just absolutely fascinating. But the skills he had as a thinker, as a communicator, I think he would have been a good Prime Minister.
I will do some research into that and come back to you separately. Thank you. My final question, and I'm really glad you brought up that you stood as a PPC in 2010, because I definitely had written it down and was going to try and worm it in somehow to this discussion. But my final question is, given your experience, nearly 20 years in public affairs, I imagine you've worked with some very, very competent people that could, if the stars aligned and circumstances were right, could be MPs. Is there anyone at all that you're happy to name drop on here that you the type of person you have either worked with or engaged with in some capacity that you think could be a really good MP if given the chance?
Oh, that's a tough question.
You've covered yourself, obviously.
Apart from me, of course.
That's implied.
Yeah. Do you know what? There's a lot of talent in public affairs. I would say that, wouldn't I? But there's a lot of people you come across and you think you're really impressive. So the skills you need in public affairs are quite broad. So you might be very good at communicating, or you might have a policy brain, you might be really interested in the detail, or you might be very good with people, or you might have all of those skills. So you do come across people and you think you are particularly impressive. I remember, probably not surprising, but I do remember seeing Wes Streeting before he was an MP and thinking how impressive he was. So you do see people and you think you have lots of skills and you could imagine that person as an MP or a minister. So there are certainly people out there, but I would probably say it's some of those who have now become MPs who have gone through a public affairs route, and you can see even at an early stage in their careers that they are impressive and they've got certain skills, they've got certain attributes that not everybody has. And I think, it's it's fair to say in public affairs that you can be really good at certain elements but need to work on others. But occasionally you see people who have got everything.
It's a really, really good point, and I'd echo that as well based on my experience so far. So, David, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. It's been really, really good discussion. My thanks as always to Ollie Foster, our in-house producer. Perhaps you have a view on the future of public affairs and would like to share, or you'd like to add to the discussion yourself. Please follow the link in the show's bio, which will direct you to our feedback page for Helio Intelligence, which is the home of de Havilland and Forefront.